Moss, whose work is incredibly accomplished. So I decided to go more onto the biographical in terms of my career, to share also something that I've never shared with the students. Also because I've been lecturing a year ago. And maybe let's mute Moss. So I wanted to
you can do it.
I wanted to start with the title, The Rise of the Generalist, and how I think education created who I am today. And I wanted also to start with a small sentence of Daniel Dennett, who's a philosopher, and he says, what you can imagine depends on what you know. The philosophers who know only philosophy consign themselves to that janitorial role in the great enterprises of exploration that are illuminating the mysteries of our lives. And I think in a way, architecture as well, if you want to imagine, you have to learn, and education is the first step to get there. For many of you, I don't know how many of you know this, but I come from Bologna, Italy. I thought it was important for me to say, because last time I was talking to John Cooper and I had a picture of the towers of Bologna, and he asked me if it was San Gimignano. So I'm gonna have to get this straight, that I am from Bologna. Bologna is a city in the north of Italy, a medieval town that once upon a time when Dante lived there, it looked like a small Manhattan, to the point that actually it is part of the Divina Commedia as the city of the towers. I just wanted to mention this because living and growing up for 22 years in a city that is so characteristic, I think changed my way of seeing architecture. This was where I went to high school, actually very close to the two towers of Bologna. It was an ex-convent and a church. So I studied here for 5 years in a liberal arts school. This was a church that was used by Napoleon and the army during the war, and therefore could not be used anymore by the Pope, and therefore became a place of education. So the convent next door was my high school, and the church is where we built sculptures, we did all the artwork, and I think it did have an impact on my education, just the fact of entering every day for 5 years in a kind of building that leverages understanding of tectonics, symmetry, ordering system, size, entry procedures. I think you can name it when you enter this door and you enter a different realm, almost like a time capsule. This was our high school library with the painting above in the ceiling, just to tell you, and this is only 26 years ago, this is how we actually looked for books. So you still had to go manually into archives of this kind to find the books you wanted to learn from. I'm just saying this because I find it interesting that education somehow, I think, starts also from the architecture that provides that education. So it's not just about studying ancient Greek and Latin and philosophy and art history, which is really what I was learning there, but it's also how you access this information, which I think makes you what you are as a cultural animal afterwards. The Liceo, it was called Liceo Galvani, he's a physiologist, and we actually studied science on his personal museum collection from the 18th century, sorry, which also was a time capsule in terms of what equipment you used to learn and study and experiment. And I wanted to just show that our optical instrument, this one, was a way for us to see how two images can combine, form a three-dimensional image in the same way as you guys use augmented and virtual reality today. So somehow I think these are 26 years of difference, but somehow this is how my experience was as the first experience of architecture and culture. I went to school, this is where it's getting closer to what you guys want to see, my work in school in Bologna. Bologna is a university town. It's the oldest university in the world. It was founded in 1088. So in 68 years, it will be 1,000 years old. And it was open to women from the 13th century, which is actually, I will explain how I think this changed the school of this university and the route of education that I think people can get here. First of all, I think that one thing to say is when you go to university in a place that has 1,000 years of history, first of all, the university is everywhere. It's not just a campus. The campus is embedded in the entire city. and the entire city somehow rotates around it. And every museum, every hall, every library is actually part of the education system that has been piling up in 1,000 years. I think it was born because of the first major was actually law. That's how it was founded. And I think that's still one of the strongest and oldest university for studying diritto. But also became quite important for medicine. And these are just the library you go through when you go to school. One is the Sala Anatomica, where they are the spillato, the skin men, and you can see the body and the study of the human body. And I think one of the most fun part of the university is all the university that shows the anatomical waxes that actually was an art form in that period in Bologna. To the point that I think it somehow created a relationship between sculpture and knowledge of science, which becomes interesting when you see all these statues of the Venerina, which is a statue that you would understand being adorned like a statue, but had actually a didactical role for students. And also, I think the fact that the school was open to women from the 13th century on becomes interesting because you also see the history of women in science and women in art. This is Anna Morandi, is one of the famous scientists that also was a sculpture maker. So she made actually wax sculpture, and this is a self-portrait. So she made a wax portrait of herself, and what you see in front of herself is her brain, which I think is actually telling of a city that has been open because of the position of the university to a variety of possibilities for not only men, but also women to learn and to be part of the educational system. It's also famous for the Beaux-Arts and the history of Guido Reni, which somehow started a painting school in Bologna. And maybe the three most important artists that I want to mention before I go to more personal work is Properza De Rossi, who was the only woman that has been made the cut to enter Le Vite del Vasari as a sculptor. There is no other woman in the Renaissance, and she was from Bologna. Lavinia Fontana, who had also a PhD from the university in the Baroque time, which was unheard of. And finally, Elisabetta Sirani, that founded the first all-women school in Europe for women to learn how to paint, even if you didn't have a father that was a painter. I think the fact that this university has been open to women for 700 years made it one of the largest cities in northern Italy that was extremely receptive to women. And partially was also because of the way in which the government in Bologna worked. It was 70 noble families, not one, and they all somehow wanted to promote and patronize the arts. On the other hand, I went to engineering school as my undergraduate. As many of you know, it's a 5 years degree. At that point, there was no exam of admission. So actually 600 people enrolled like I did. 6 graduated on time. So just to give you a sense of what happens in Italy, it's like everybody has access to that education. There is no exam of admission. Also, there is no barrier in terms of money because it costed $600 to go to school when I did this. But also you are in a structure with a ratio between faculty and students of 1 to 600, which means that somehow you go through school on your own. I did a lot of this, meaning I did a lot of math and calculus. And somehow, that's why I put it together with my high school, because it was a desire, I think, to complete an education that clearly in high school was completely focused on liberal arts. And I wanted to continue and learn the math and calculus that I didn't get into high school as much as I should have. Just to go into the drawing component, the drawings that I was producing at that time, this was the drawing 1 exam. And it basically, the 600 students, entering students, we decided to take on this drawing, which is a axonometric painting of Bologna, which exists in the Sala Vaticana and only the Pope really sees it. It's the first painting, an axonometric painting, where you can see basically the painter chose 2 angles of representation that then kept the measurement of the city. So there was a desire to keep this as a map. And everything that is in gold is owned clearly by the church. So all the roofs that are gold shaped gold colored are from the Pope. And so I was producing basically these kind of drawings at university that were the drawings of the city we lived in. And it was the representational of a pictorial canvas. The architects that were teaching studio at that point when I was in school were Gianni Braghieri, Aldo Rossi, and Giuliano Grasleri. Giuliano Grasleri, I left here a little sketch of José Uberi, because they both worked on l'Esprit Nouveau of Le Corbusier in Bologna. So I had basically an education that was based a lot on modernist architecture, but then Aldo Rossi and Gianni Braghieri, clearly the postmodern, the Italian postmodern. In '97, the year I went to the United States, Aldo Rossi died in a car accident, and Gianni Braghieri founded a new school of architecture out of the engineering school in Cesena. Aldo Rossi and Gianni Braghieri are the ones that actually work together on the project that probably you guys know the most, the cemetery of San Cataldo. These are the drawings that are at the MoCA. And so they were my teachers for, either a hardcore modernist and a hardcore postmodernist education before coming to the United States. And that happened. I got a scholarship from UCLA. So in '97, at the age of 22, I came to LA. And I landed September 11th, 1997, which became 4 years after a very important date in American history, and made my life through visa a hell, because every time I need to renew my visa was on September 11th, so you can imagine. And so basically my life has been 23 years in Italy and 23 years in the United States this year. I thought it was interesting to have this career talk about this. And I landed to a city very different from Bologna. And that was my first time in the United States. So I did not know anything about it. I did not know anything about UCLA either. My scholarship was actually from the engineering department, not architecture. And so I went from the Bologna di Dante to the skyline of Los Angeles in 2 days of travel. And I entered UCLA, where the ratio between instructor and students was 1 to 12, where the students were half of the one that were in Bologna, where the tuitions were actually quite low anyway, 8,000 for in-state, 15,000 for out-of-state, and where I had 2 jobs to maintain myself. I taught quantum mechanics at the pre-med students, and I worked in a kitchen in the campus to pay my way for my rent, because tuitions was paid, but I still needed to live. So I worked in the physics and astronomy department. I was studying engineering to finish my Italian courses in LA, and also I was taking the first year of master at the architectural department. It's something I do not recommend to do what I've done. I've done it for 3 years to combine my last year of engineering, my thesis in engineering, my 3 years of master in MArch1, and the final thesis in MArch1, all in 3 years. So I think I slept 3 hours a night, but it was an intense time. Sylvia Levin was the chair. She became the chair in '96. I started in '97. So I was literally her first class, the first recruitment she has had. And I had phenomenal teachers. I did not know anything when I came. I mean, I knew I had a scholarship and that's it. Tom Main was my teacher of portfolio the first year. I had Greg Lynn as an important teacher in my life. Zahadi, Toyo Ito, Wolf Pricks, Peter Eisenman, Glenn Marcotte, and keep going. So anything and anything you can imagine. And I realized very quickly that it was an incredible opportunity to be at UCLA at the time she was a chair. And so that's why probably I worked as hard as I did to stay there and to keep on getting the scholarship that would allow me to be there. Sylvia Levin, Jeff Kipnis, Bob Sommel, Tony Winder, and Dana Kaff were the theorists at that time. And the rest of the faculty, somehow, probably you know many of the names. So this was my first year project. So the year before, I was drawing Bologna, and the year after, this was my first digital project. So that's when I landed in Los Angeles. And this was done in Alias Wavefront. We had only 2 machines in the school, and we had maybe 15 students that wanted to use it. So we just drew from a hat in like 2 hours each around the clock. So you might have 2 to 4 a.m. and that's as much time as you got on the computer. None of us had computers. None of us had personal computers. None of us even had cell phone at that time. So truly the only access to digital education came from the equipment you had in school. This was again in 98, I think. So 97, the first one that was in 98. Was the first years where the school got a CNC machine and got into fabrication. And so this is just a sample of the work. My thesis was with Greg Lin and Bob Sommel as combined thesis advisor. It was called Local Surfaces. And it was about the facade of buildings, which is, I think, something I've been working on for the past 20 years. And it took the ghetto in Venice and as a source of information. And the ghetto in Venice is a part of the Venice ghetto where the Jewish people were supposed to live. And you can see that in 500 years of confinement, the surfaces of the building suddenly have new fenestrations, new slabs. You can see that just simply the fabric of the elevation of the city changes because the intensity of what was happening inside the population was growing. And so all my thesis was about studying that condition of how surfaces of buildings are a mirror of what happened inside and the kind of intelligence that facades have to become this display of public presence of the identity of the ghetto. Basically, the end of the MRCOM program was for us, for those years, the Biennale in Venice. It was the year 2000, the year I graduated. It took 3 years to finish MRCOM, clearly. And UCLA and Columbia, they had the American Pavilion. They won the American Pavilion. So on the right hand was Greg Lin's team, and I was part of that. And on the left hand was Hani Rashid of Columbia. And it was a very interesting way to finish because although the thesis was important, I think somehow the exhibition of a Biennale was the most important way to finish for me, for my studies. It was a Biennale curated by Fuxas. It was called Less Aesthetic, More Ethics. And I think it was an incredible Biennale in many ways. I think it was the last of the phenomenal ones. I then worked for 4 years for Greg Lin, and as Jackie and Florencia, most of the work I've done for him is in this book. And in 2003, I started teaching at SCI-Arc because Chris Gannick, who was my teacher actually at UCLA, the person that was my teacher when I did the first project, liked it and invited me to teach. So in 2003, I started teaching at SCI-Arc, and in 2004, I started my own office. And these are the 3 publications that are combining the work I've done in these years, the first 10 years, then a project on painting, and then one upcoming on the project of colors. This was the first project that I did on my own during the evening when I was at Greg Lin's, and I think it was just to try something else that was not digital actually. I did a small collection of clothes. It was honestly not supposed to be a project. It was supposed to be a hobby. And I was doing this with my neighbor, so you can imagine. And the project became a small collection that went to the Santa Monica Bergamo station. We had a show. These are some of the clothing that we've been doing. It was all 3D model, unfolded, laser cut, put together. And the collection actually made it to the cover of LA Architect. And this is a moment where somehow in my career, then I thought, okay, I probably need to do things on my own at this point. And I started teaching. This opened up a new avenue of things that happened to me, one of which was the work for the Schindler House that then brought me to Nike, which was a project that got me the Best Design Award in 2005 in the entire award for the Best Product Design for the Nike Sphere collection. And then after that, a lot of projects that somehow riffed from that first exercise on fabric that were usually installations, some of them at SCI-Arc, that has been a great platform, I have to say, to propel young faculty experimentation. For this, we have really to thank Eric for his support to give this opportunity to young architects to do something new. And then the project somehow morphed into more projects, larger projects, and it went from geometrical to pictorial, to augmented reality, and and I'm just going to flip through a few of those where you can see the work on facades and painting somehow starting to occupying, hopefully, the work of architecture. And so these are, I just want to finish with a couple of projects that are under construction. And that's it. And then I'm going to give it to Eric Moss.
Thank you. That was great. You know, I don't know, Eric, if you've seen any of these career days, but what is wonderful is that you see the arc. We call it the arc. No, Christy, not the arch. So it's at the peak of careers, not at the end of career. So to borrow from Christy, and so that was great. I love it. You know. So okay, Eric, your turn. You can share screen. Now, Faris, could you unmute Eric, please? Hold on, Eric. We muted you. Now that, yes, you can talk. Oh, hold on, something happened. Yes, go ahead.
Ready?
Yes, I'm going to.
You sure?
Faris, maybe you can spotlight Eric so he can. Thank you, Faris. The floor is yours. The screen is yours.
The floor, the wall, and the ceiling. Thank you for the invitation. We made a video, a short video, which is an effort to account for the past, the present, the future in a conceptual way, in a personal way, and in terms of the kind of work that we're producing at the moment. So with the exception of one project, everything you're going to see is work that we're involved in designing and building at the moment. So here we go.
What was the last project, Eddie, for the White House? I couldn't see. I have the people bar.
You know,
what year was that? I couldn't see the year. What year was that?
That's the only project that's not contemporary. Kennedy's kid, who was killed in that airplane crash, made a magazine. It's called George, and it was a glitzy magazine for the most part, with some politics and some culture and art and so on. And he asked me, and he asked a few other people, to redesign the White House. And that image has some meaning to me in terms, not so much of the condition in 1997, which is when it was done, but it belongs, I think, very much to the contemporary condition. So the answer to the question is, it was done 23 years ago. The other work is contemporaneous. So thank you very much.
You want to, just to tell the students, remember that we had that conversation the last time on live chat. You want to tell the student what school you went, how was your beginning? Just with no images, with words.
Where I went to school? I went to school various parts of Berkeley, Harvard, and UCLA. And that's where I went to school.
In that order?
No, not that order. I went to UCLA, then I went to Cal, then I went to Harvard.
Remember, we were saying how what was happening in the time that you were in Berkeley at the conversation the last time. Like you went through special times, you know, for your generation at that period.
Yeah, I don't really see it that way, but I think most people do. That there's a particular point in your life, if you lived through the First World War or the Depression or the Iraq War or the COVID or the flu of 1918 or whatever it is. And I think conceptually, the thought is that those kinds of historic moments that seem to reconnoiter the world or a big part of it then become what makes you what you are, and you belong to that history, to that pedigree, to that experience. And I think there was a quote in the little video, and it came out of a debate I had with Jeff. You know, Ohio State makes those books, and we made a book, I don't know, a few years ago. And we were talking about this conception of pivot points in people's lives. Because the implication of the question is, because I was there when Yale and Wisconsin and Harvard and Berkeley were doing the things that they were doing in the late 60s and early 70s, that somehow accounts for what I was or what I became. And I never felt that was so. In fact, I think consciously tried to make it not so that whether I can do that or not, we could debate. But that was my aspiration, that I wouldn't belong to a particular time and a place, which makes it easy for people to assign other people's positions to an era. So I've tried not to do that. I can't say that those events weren't influential, but not in the way that I think it made me what I was, or what I believe, or what I feel. As a matter of fact, my experience with that period of time, both at Harvard, and there were interesting people. I mean, William Sloane Coffin and Mario Savio. There's a lot of music that came out of that era, politicians that hung around in Berkeley. but I think that there were marches, there were advocacies, and in the end, I came to a conclusion that I couldn't sign up for anything. That I remember a big, and I've talked about this a little bit, certainly with Jeff, a huge march in Market Street in the late 60s against the Vietnam War. And I remember looking at these signs that said, the President of the United States is Hitler, and things like that. And although I think my sympathies generally were inclined in a more progressive way, the cartooning of ideas and the caricature of belief systems takes away almost all of the subtleties and the nuances. And there's so many ways to look and think and feel and understand and the way things work, and it's certainly true today as well, that the polarization of sides forces people in so many cases to sign up with one and to reject the other. And I tried not to do that. I'm not sure I was entirely successful. Not only not to do that, but not to belong to the issues in the frame of reference that is associated with a particular time. Does that answer the question?
No, I saw one of the quotes. I thought I was reading, not Dante, I'm confusing with Elena. Well, you have the plot. But then there was a quote that you said, I feel like an orphan. So that sounds like Eric. And it was like, so I think that's part of that quote, being an orphan of history.
It is. I mean, it wasn't, it's not a matter, it's an internal matter. It's not a matter of trying to be odd or trying to be different or trying to show off or trying to do any of those things. And I think in some ways, and it's probably still true, that I made efforts to belong to things and to be part of things that never really worked. I mean, it provides you with the kind of pedigree and a line of discussion and a belief system and a right and a wrong. And looking back over history, there are so many of those moments for you and for me and for all of us. And so I pick what I need, I think, in order to do the next things. And if at some point, I remember saying at SCI-Arc years ago, and this is not so much a statement of a lack of ethics or principle. In some ways, SCI-Arc would never have any permanent friends or enemies. And that depending on who did what and who behaved how, we might move the way we needed to move. And that's the way the office works. And I just grafted it on to SCI-Arc. But I'm not saying I'm a non-believer. I think when we did that Gnostic architecture book years ago, I can associate with that, which is an interesting way to find. It's not that you don't believe in anything. It's not nihilism, but you have to find your way. And I mean, it sounds like, I mean, depending on who's listening, it's not an attempt necessarily to be heroic. It's an attempt to try to understand and to work. And that seemed to work for me internally, not without its own difficulties. But affiliations just didn't seem to work for me. And intellectually, if you can, I mean, you have to bear up under it. Because essentially what I'm advocating is that you have to hold yourself up, maybe along with a few colleagues.
Thank you. I extended a few questions because I wanted to get some of your, that arc that I was talking about. So I'd like to open to questions now. Today we have 2, sometimes we have 3, and sometimes 4, but that depends on the scheduling issues or cancellations. So I don't know, the students, I like to open to the students questions for Elena, questions for Eric. You know, you can also add your question to the Zoom chat.
So Eric, which one was your first job? Somebody asked, Fatima asked, so I want to know as well. Who did you work for? Did you ever work for somebody?
The first
job
I had,
yes.
Out of school.
Out of school, yes. Let's
Yeah,
talk the real business here.
I couldn't invent a job. I tried. I worked for a guy by the name of Pafford Clay. Do you know Pafford?
No.
Okay. If you go in the SCI-Arc library,
okay,
we made a book on Pafford. He's an interesting guy. Married, I think, Siegfried Gideon's daughter, worked for Le Corbusier, worked for Wright. Don't know if he was connected to Mies, was at Taliesin for a while, came to San Francisco. And if you want to see an unusual building that he did, the San Francisco State Student Union,
okay,
the series, it's a kind of fascinating hunk of concrete. And he also did the San Francisco Art Center. We brought him to SCI-Arc. We made a book, like we did on so many of those occasions. We had a debate with, I think, Leb and Raymond and Tom, and I can't remember who else. And he made some friends in LA. He was essentially evicted from San Francisco, but he's a fascinating guy. He's still alive, and he lives in Seville in Spain. So that was the first job in San Francisco. And we did the San Francisco Art Institute. That's the project we worked on.
Margaret, they put the building in the chat for everybody to see.
You mean the Art Institute or the Student Union? If you want to take, if you're interested in Pafford, I mean, you can look at the book, but if you look for the San Francisco State Student Union, which is obviously in San Francisco, or the San Francisco Art Institute, which is Columbus near Fisherman's Wharf. And those were the two projects.
I think it's the Art Institute, no?
Art Institute is one.
Margaret, I think she put that. That's the one. Yeah, it's
And
very, yeah. You see Le Corbusier there.
Right. It looks like it's right out of Le Corbusier, and it is.
Eric, there's another question from Orgu. She says, Eric, did you work for Kenzo Tange, or were you his student, or both?
Tange was at Harvard when I was there, hanging around with Jose Luis Sert. So he was teaching there. And I was interested in that work before I went back to school, before I went to Harvard. I went to Tokyo, actually, met with him, and that's where I met Iso, because Iso was working in his office, and they were doing that World's Fair, the Osaka thing, the space frame, and the robots, and all of that. And that was fascinating, I have to say, because Iso is so, I mean, Tange is a believer, and had enormous confidence in an ideological way in the prowess and the capacity of architecture. And I think I share that. Iso was more skeptical. And Iso made a drawing, which I remember, which had to do with the Parthenon collapsing and all of, if you look at Tange's radio TV newspaper station near Mount Fuji, and that's falling down, and the Parthenon is falling down, and it was one of these kind of, it comes and it goes, which may be a reason to do it, but not to expect much, or a reason to do it and to expect more, or a reason not to do it. And I think intellectually, Sasaki was of great interest to me. And I hadn't seen him for a while, but Kipnis set up a lecture at Tokyo University. It must have been, I don't know, a couple years ago, and I got a chance to actually sit and talk to him for a couple hours again. Tanguy was at Harvard and mostly screwing around with Shadrach Woods and Jose Luis Sert, but he was in a studio. I didn't work for him, but we spent a lot of time together talking about some of the work that he had done. The Olympic stadiums interested me a lot, and the radio TV station as well. It's interesting, Elena was showing Bologna, and Tanguy, I think I have it right, Tanguy did an expansion,
yes.
right, he did, and I
fair.
think it was a competition, and I remember him telling me they built it and he didn't know.
They built it multiple times. I'm gonna tell you, they built another one maybe 5 years ago. So not only they built them, but they built also copies of it. Is in the fair district of Bologna. It is actually in front of the Esprit Nouveau of Le Corbusier, the one that José Aubry and Grasleri remodeled together.
But I remember him saying somebody sent him a photograph, so they did a competition. I think it was one of these, it's like what so often happens in East Asia and China. You win, and you don't know what happens next. That happens sometimes. So he won, that was the end, and somehow in some political and economic process started to build the thing, and I think they ultimately built it.
They built many, and again for Savdi, they even built another one lately. So the copy, you know, the twins. You should look at the towers of Kinzo-Tange in Bologna.
Right.
They're not beautiful, but you know, they do the job. I actually like, you know, they do what they need to do.
He's an ideologue. I mean, it was right. I mean, it's a theory for let's cover the earth. I mean, the radio TV station, I think, is a good project precisely because it didn't do. His aspiration are masts and precast beams from here to Jupiter. Unfortunately, it became a discrete project. And in that context, I think it's a pretty good building.
Hi, I was thinking it might be fun to talk about SCI-Arc in 2002, 2003, since Elena, I saw that you came in 2003 and Eric, you took over as director, and I think in 2002, if I'm correct. It might be interesting to talk about what the atmosphere was like.
Yeah, I was hired by Chris Ganick, who was actually my teacher at UCLA. I think somehow that's the project I showed was the first one I did with him, and I think he was impressed by the work, and he asked me to teach at SCI-Arc twice. Actually, the first time I said no because I was at Greg's office. The second time I said yes. SCI-Arc was it was becoming. I don't know how to say another word. It was clear that if UCLA was established, SCI-Arc wasn't, but it was on the verge of actually being very interesting because of the people that Eric and Chris Ganick and Ming were starting to hire. They were taking, I think, a risk, you know, hiring people that were maybe 27, 28, 29, very young, very aggressively dedicated to a new kind of architecture that I thought was almost counterpart to what they were as directors. It was interesting to see them do this. I mean, Eric has been always a person that liked to challenge himself, I would say. Can I say this of you, Eric? I mean, he likes to have a conversation, not with the same voices that he can maybe support. I mean, this was interesting to see that they went beyond what they believed in and expand towards the new in a time where it was not that obvious. And I think there was a lot of transfer of knowledge from some people at UCLA towards SCI-Arc, which came because of the affiliation of Chris Ganick with UCLA. He taught there for a while. He hired a few people, not only me, Florencia, and also people in the shop that actually built up the shop at that point. They were actually from UCLA and also Tom Wiscombe. I mean, Tom went to school when I went to school, and a few more people at that time. And so I think SCI-Arc was just, not just actually a few years, has been in downtown when I came. So we were outside of the tent. I never seen the tent. I mean, these were just memories that I've heard of. But Eric might know more about it. And it was clear to me that actually the school was on a very good ground at that point. So I'm gonna let the microphone to Eric, who has been taking some risk, I would say, with all these foreigners coming out of school. They didn't speak English, okay? So Eric, that's to you. why did you hire us?
So the question is, what was it like? What's the question? 2002, 2003?
2002, 2003. After 1 or 2 years, you were
I mean, I have
on
to,
top there.
I have to say this because if Florencia does this every week, what's always interesting to me is people looking back, like you did with Bologna, and your academic history and your current professional history, and telling a certain kind of story. And I'm not sure whether, frankly, this is more a discussion about what history is, whether looking back on it, knowing the results, and living it at a point when you don't know the result, the mindsets are so entirely different.
Sure, absolutely.
They're utterly different. And so if it worked, you can tell the story and we're all heroes. And if it blew up, we're all bums or whatever it is. But so I'm not sure it's possible to say now. You could intellectualize it, but the emotions of that time, and I'm not sure actually why I did that. In retrospect, I don't think it was something I ever aspired to. I think it was more something I stumbled into. I think the only job like that, frankly, that had interested me and that I was a candidate for at one point was Yale. I was teaching at Yale a little bit. It's a small school. It has a monastic aspect, or it did at a certain point, very different than the GSD. Anyway, so I didn't walk into this with a hypothesis about what we should do or what we shouldn't do. And I also didn't know the details, the economic details, the accreditation details. But I do remember that Ian Robertson, who was the chairman of the board of an illicit board, it turned out, every rule had been broken. Every fiscal accounting was in arrears, every accreditation. So there are a whole series of very interesting problems that nobody really knew. And so it was a matter of trying to figure out what those were. It was a matter always in principle of trying to build on an idealized, if not always an accurate or literally true representation of what SCI-Arc was and is and could be. It was never a matter of trying to find somebody, oh, it went sideways, you know, it was the janitor, or it was the structural engineer, or it was the building department, or it was the bank, or it was never that. I think the principle, the operational principle, was hold the school together, move the school forward. I don't think I ever gave a damn about these parallels between this school and what is Yale doing or what is UCLA. It didn't make any difference to me at all. And we never operated as if they were competitors. I mean, I think the way we operated was SCI-Arc is a subject. What is it? How do we find out what it is? Who do we include in the discussion? We made books and we made lectures and we made debates and we made exhibitions, all of that. And then there was a pragmatic side of the thing, which is, you know, does the roof leak? Does the air conditioning work? There was no shop. There were no machines. So all of those things had to be done. So we had to figure out ways of putting it back together again. And I think we did. And when we got done, I left. And I think in that point, it introduced a new chapter. And I think it's for you people to say what worked and what didn't and what it should do next. And you're doing that. That's good.
It was raw, I have to say, but I think it was raw in a very good way. There was clear energy. I think I have to say, Eric, it was clear going to SCI-Arc that SCI-Arc was not looking at anything else but SCI-Arc. Whereas in other schools, like when I was involved, UCLA, I was a student, you would always look at other schools. Somehow it was this idea that you had to rank yourself against them. Whereas at SCI-Arc, it truly was clear that Eric, but in general, everybody was just very intensively consumed with the idea of doing the best work we could do, and to, in a way, to use this platform in the most free way we could. Because not having an institution was actually a big change, I thought, in terms of what your mindset becomes. Then you suddenly are much more of a protagonist. There's much less weight on your shoulder. There's less oppression about what you need to do. And I think SCI-Arc had that feeling at that point. And I think still has, frankly, yes.
I think that's, when I said initially, when Florencia asked me the question about in a conceptual effort to designate people as a function either of eras they've lived through or eras they came out of, and I was trying to say I would prefer not to think about it that way. Whether I can do that or not is up to you to decide. But I do think that SCI-Arc, we handled SCI-Arc exactly in that way. Nobody knows what architecture is, so we don't need a quote from Ken Frampton or Iso or Siegfried Gideon or Frida Kahlo. They're all interesting people, but we'll decide, and we'll collectively, we'll work on that, and we'll develop our own definition. If we're successful at that, or if that intellectual content and emotional content is stimulating enough, people will come to participate in it in that period of time, energy, content, and so on. So we weren't looking for experts, and we're still not. We're the experts. I mean, that was the premise. Whether that was right or wrong, so somebody else can say, but that's the premise that we advanced on. That's how we made the school.
So there is a question from Wesley to me, which I thought I should answer, is asking me about, I put that project in there to show you how a small thing actually might change your, or derail or change in a good way your life. Yes, the project I showed was truly the first project I did on my own with my neighbor. It came out of the desire to do something with materials, and frankly, just to do design without the computer in many ways. And while during the day and the weeks and weekends, I was working on somebody else's office also just to have something creative. So it was maybe an escapade more than anything. It became fun to think about something at that scale because it was so manageable. Instead of looking at a building that was never going to be built or too big to see the end of it while you were in an office, it took like, you couldn't imagine see the end. Whereas that you could see the end in a couple of weeks. You could do a mock-up, buy them fabric, sew it together. There was this idea of making a physical model somehow at the real scale of this, and the project could exist at that scale was very liberating. And it was a bit of the time, I think, where developable surfaces became something, I think, in architecture. I mean, clearly Frangeri much earlier, in 98, he built, 97, 98, the Walt Disney Hall was under construction. I actually, at that point, knew very well the engineers that did all the facades, which is Permasterizza, it's an Italian company that did all the facades for these buildings. And so you become obsessed with the idea of making things with paper and fabric because they're developable, because you can achieve curvature. So some of the things you could do at the scale of a building, you could definitely do at the scale of a model for clothing. And so to me, it was more, can you control materials so that you could learn techniques from this route that you will not know ahead of time doing them on the computer. And in a way, I think I was looking very much at Frangeri's techniques with paper when I was doing the clothing. And it became very clear to me what I think the pleasure he found in manipulating paper that then would become steel. And to me, the fabric that I chose was fabric that wouldn't stretch, that did certain things when it was flat or folded. It became an exercise in geometry, to be honest with you. That's why I loved that project. It ended up being something more because of the fact that at that point, there was an interest in those techniques. So when I was working through the computer to do those developable surfaces, it came out a story that got a cover on a magazine. In a way, because it was a novelty of seeing somebody doing this. I mean, although there's a long line, I think, of architects that design beyond the scope of work of architecture. And that's why I call the lecture, The Rise of the Generalist, because I think that there are things that actually are multidisciplinary and cross-culture. And that was one of those moments where I learned through making something that I thought I've seen done well by other architects, and I wanted to experiment with it. It did take me to a route that was quite different at that point. It became, I did a few collections. I mean, I showed a couple of things, but it truly was the production of a few years. The work that came after this and the work with Nike. And so it was absolutely fun, enjoyable, and unexpected. And youth, you know, it's like I was very young when Nike came to see me in my studio in Venice, and so where I was making the clothing that they were selling, they were like, you know, there was some surprises there, you know. It's like I had a small studio in Venice Beach, and that's where I worked. And so anyway, the whole team came, and I was like, I don't know where to sit you. Can you sit on the bed? I didn't even have chairs for all of you guys. So it was fun, you know. It's like when you're in your 20s, you do this stuff, and I, you know, I got to work with amazing people through that, very creative people. New message. Okay.
Any further questions? Yeah.
And also, you know what it is? SCI-Arc never said no. Even if Eric could not disapprove more of my escapades to other fields of design, he was never he was never, I mean, he would question me. He would question everybody, to be honest with you, all this young generation. I think we went through serious interrogations, personal interrogation, or in front of everybody. But I think somehow he always let us do it. I mean, nobody told us this is how the curriculum needs to be. I mean, that's a really great freedom to have when you're young and you have a lot of things to do, and you have this energy and incredible desire to test it, having the ability to test it. Then you get criticized heavily, but I think you learn through that as well. So that freedom, I think, was interesting. Also, very green years. Yes. I think at that point I was lying to my students. I was 29. I was telling them I was 30 or something more. Oh yeah, I was like, now I lie the other way, but I remember, I don't know, Florencia, you what it did, but it was like the first years I was like, students were older than me, and I was like, no. So I lied about my age.
I did lie. I didn't lie, I just didn't say my age. But I just wanted to say, you know, to that point, you know, Eric's, you know, support. I'm going to be showing next week also the exhibition that I did at the early age, like Elena, you did. You were doing all the fashion. And I remember the photos of your exhibit. Elena had also,
the models,
I don't know if, yeah, the models in there. I don't know, you showed those, no?
I did not, no.
No, you show another one. Yeah. So I remember the photos had the models with the, you know, were almost as if the exhibition aside were the background. And we were so young, because I think I did my exhibit like 2 years before that. And you know, again, you know, Eric just like, yes, what are your ideas? Just give it a try. Go there, do something, do something in that. It's a huge gallery also, by the way. So
I think that's Florencia. I think to pick up on that for 2 seconds, and also what Elena said, it's important to do those things out on the street, in the city, in the world. And I think if there was a premise that, for me, notwithstanding I said there was no permanent premise, I think architecture historically is fragile. That doesn't mean it doesn't get done, but it doesn't get done at the level that interests us over and over and over in lots and lots of hands. So for me, it wasn't so much that fashion wasn't of interest, or food wasn't of interest, or film wasn't of interest, or literature wasn't of interest. I think all of those intellectual pursuits add, and person by person add to the content of the work. But it was, for me, important to go out and build, and whether it is in the context of an exhibition or a small project, it's not a function of the size. It's never a function of the size, but it is a function of, can you imagine it conceptually? Can you imagine it technically? And can you imagine its implementation? All three.
I couldn't agree more. I think having the chance of building something, even in a small space or even in a protected condition, was a big, a big thing to do for us. We were like in our 20s, and it was extremely looked at. I mean, I think that was the exhibition where I worked on the most. I mean, no budget was, little budget, but truly the idea that you put something there among your peer and your colleague is actually quite high pressure, I thought at that time, and it was important. Although maybe I've done even things that were bigger before, with bigger budgets and bigger sizes. It was a very important platform, at least at that point, I think, because there was you said, you declare what you've done. You made some kind of declaration about what you think architecture should be or what kind of contribution you can give. And so having that opportunity in your 20s is actually a great thing that the school has given to many of us. Any other questions about fashion?
I think with that, if we have any final questions, also you can put it in the chat. Otherwise, I'll begin thanking both Eric and Elena. I think it was wonderful. Thank you for preparing them. They were thoroughly set up and prepared. So it was great. I mean, I think that I'm really happy with these career days. I mean, people that I know, like Elena and Eric, for so long, there's always something new to learn. So thank you, guys. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to the students, and see you on Friday for live chat. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Tonight there's a kitchen talk as well.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.